75, 70s, I'm sorry, it's 8075. This week, we will be talking about popular education, self help, and community. We are in week 7. The objectives, uh, if we were in class, we would actually practice a participatory method. We'll have to do that next week. We'll theoretically we'll talk about 3 examples of non-market, non-state models of community practice. On your own, you can use the community analysis handouts in Chapter 7 of the Omer and Damasi book to guide your group project. There are, these are like checklists of questions, things to learn about your community to get a better sense of the different kinds of stakeholders. Not all of them will be relevant to what you're doing. It's just a guide that you would adapt for your purposes. Part of our ethical guide from NASW Code of Ethics, social workers should facilitate informed participation by the public in shaping social policies and institutions. These readings, these themes of self-help, participatory methods, they all intersect with healthy development for youth, achieving equal opportunity and justice, and ending social isolation. In other words, you bring people together, and that's a necessary precondition for social justice and equal opportunity. All right, so the quiz we'll do in Canvas. So how does World Cafe Week work? We've practiced open space, which is much less structured. World Cafe is slightly more structured. You'll have a context, like a reason for gathering. The room should be set up in a hospitable way, literally like a cafe with snacks, homey, comfy furniture, homey decorations. Now, obviously, that's not always going to happen, but you should try to make sure that the room is as hospitable as possible. You should prepare questions in advance, and they should matter to the people there. Encourage that everyone make a contribution. Should be diverse perspectives, and the facilitator should help listen. If you click here or here, you can get the full instruction manual. Typically, you'll have 4 to 5 people at a table. The facilitator will welcome people. Each table will also have a table captain or facilitator. Maybe talk 20 minutes, answer the questions at that table. There's usually some paper. Everyone gets some paper to take notes. There's some butcher paper for that table that stays there. That table host stays to make sure that the conversation continues and maintains this sheet. And then at the end of the 20 minutes, everyone else goes to the next table, but they bring the conversation to the next table and they start over again. And then at the end of that, each table captain reports out what happened at these tables. I've done this where you do 3 rounds. I've done it where you do 4 rounds. That's up to the facilitator. So this is more of a networking and open-ended set of discussions. So one I went to was on sustainability in Detroit neighborhoods, and the invitees were community development organizations. I've also done one with university community partnerships, where you had people from the university, people from the community, and all the questions were about how to improve projects with relationships like that. So some of the participatory methods discussed in the Good Neighborhoods Initiative, they include participatory neighborhood mapping, and also photo voice with youth, which is to say, having youth take photographs of their community and then describe what those photographs mean to them and share that, often in a public, quasi-public setting. Many other methods of engagement with the community were used: small groups, focus groups, stakeholder meetings with nonprofits, and then larger planning meetings. And these were coordinated by the Technical Assistance Center, which in the first 2 years of Good Neighborhoods was staffed by a Wayne State University graduate, and then later Sonia Harb, a U of M social worker, who we actually work with to this day on various projects. Building capacity is another method where residents are trained to be leaders, or trained to rather build skills for their leadership. Oftentimes they are leaders, but they might need support with, grant writing or decision-making processes, facilitation skills, or they set up their own learning communities on learning about the best practices in youth employment or transportation. Other participatory models covered in the Handbook of Community Practice, they range both at the neighborhood level all the way to the societal level. So, what are the values and ideology behind these participatory methods? Self-help we've talked about, and that's the idea that the community has to provide for its own needs, rather than relying on a national government. And so, it's basically starting with the assets you have, and we've talked about that in class already. Popular education comes from the tradition of consciousness raising. Like, literally, it can mean education for things like literacy, job, life skills, but it is the idea that people learn about how society is organized, and where the conflicts are and how to resolve them. And then people, by understanding systems of power, then can act to change them. Now, the communitarian philosophy, it is skeptical of both the market and the state. So it embraces community as a way of supporting the well-being of individuals and families. So that sometimes some communitarians might articulate themselves as a moderate politically, but arguably they're to the right of center. But they are by no means individualists, like free marketeers. They do believe that a community is greater than the sum of its parts. Some examples of self-help: community gardening, and how that builds social capital, improves diets and health outcomes, using both the knowledge and the land inside the community. This is a shot of the Earthworks farm on the east side. Another popular education case, the Highlander Training Institute in Tennessee. This training school has taught people like Martin Luther King Jr., Pete Seeger, Rosa Parks. They all studied how to organize at Highlander. Oh, spoiler alert, in case you didn't know, the bus thing, that was planned years in advance. Okay, so one idea of popular education is that what many experience is called the banking model of education, the idea that teachers deposit ideas into their students' head. And that can only reproduce the dominant ideology. Whereas popular education, it's a matter of dialogue and problem posing. So teachers and students share the production of knowledge, where the teachers and students are the subjects. It is the world that's the object being created. And if you haven't noticed, that's, uh, you know, something I attempt at least. And that's the difference between schooling and education. Most people experience schooling, but what is done at places like Highlander by literacy experts like Paulo Freire, that is education. That's slightly different than organizing, and we'll talk more about organizing in a few weeks. Um, Organizers bring people together on self-interest, uh, but it is different than popular education. And the popular educators suggest that the whole tradition of having expert organizers, that can be disempowering. Another local example of popular education is Grace Lee Boggs' Detroit Summer. She created freedom schools and summer programs for youth, and asked the children to, or these were more like middle school, high school age, what ideas they had in changing the world, so that they could become active participants in the revitalization of Detroit. This harkens back to the work of Dewey, where schools should be preparing for citizenship, not just for the marketplace. And people who worked in Detroit summer went on to found places like Back Alley Bikes and the Hub on Cass Street that teach kids how to fix their own bike. And if they pass their bike class, then they can get a bike that's been donated. Um, Juan here makes bicycle vans and bicycle animals. Sometimes they're on display at Eastern Market. Uh, some Invincible, the rapper, came out of the Detroit Summer program. And I actually had the privilege of attending the last Detroit Summer as a guest. Another case of popular education, Michigan United. They have worked with worker centers, combining the advocacy for immigrant worker rights, but also the direct provision of services for immigrant workers. And that's enacted. There's a worker center locally called the Great Lakes Worker Center that does both. So, yeah, another organization that does popular education, this is for immigrant women, called Adelante Mujeres. Uh, Historically, social scientists have thought that, you know, social rights come after getting the civil rights and the political rights. In other words, you got to get the right to vote, and then you get the social rights and welfare rights after that. But some, grassroots organizations are coming up with the idea of non-citizen citizenship, where you assert your rights just simply by taking action collectively. Um, and that this also, it comes through consciousness raising, right? So an example of communitarianism, there's a good case study from Humboldt Park, where that's a Latino neighborhood. Since this article was written, it's been gentrified, but it still is predominantly Latino. And in this area, there was a lot of organizing between organizations and institutions. And the concern was, the closer they got to the city, that they were concerned that all this organizing would lead to a stronger state, but they also wanted to work on the right to place and resist gentrification, and had to recognize that it is the state, usually the courts, that guarantee rights. So that is a quandary of this communitarian struggle stuck between the market and the state. How do you find that negotiable space? So in summary, participatory methods give the community tools for governance, budgeting, knowledge production, popular education, creates subjects as opposed to just studying objects. It's more about, the learning to be your own thinker through dialogue with each other. And communities have this, challenging role between the state and the market, in particular in terms of the protection of rights. All right.